with us right here, retired Major Danny Sjursen. He's a veteran of both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He's a former history instructor at West Point. Additionally, he's the host of a podcast called Fortress on the Hill and a regular contributor to antiwar.com, LA Times, The Nation, and Truth Dig. He's also has a new book that's coming out, available on Amazon, called Patriotic Descent. Please welcome to the show, Danny Sjursen. Danny, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
So there's so many things. So just to start off what you were talking about, what would you like to see us do on Memorial Day as opposed to what we're doing?
Well, the first thing I'd like to see is for people to pay attention. Pay attention to what's actually happening. Don't nostalgize and mythologize the casualties at Normandy. Look at what American warfare today is really like. And it's different than it was even when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. Question the concept of being there. What's the point? And whether there's something obscene, and Matt Ho and I, who jointly wrote this article, we think that there is something obscene about an American way of war that kills into the hundreds of thousands and has manufactured a way by design to make sure that very few Americans are killed in the process. I think that I would really like the American people to, take a pause from the memorializing and nostalgizing and actually question the framework of these wars. Let's bring them to a close. If not now, then when? In the midst of a pandemic.
So they always memorialize the World War II veteran, and other people have said that war has made all the other horrible wars possible because we keep pointing to that war and how we stopped the Nazis and stopped fascism and the Holocaust and all that stuff. And so that kind of gives cover for the rest of our imperialism. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. World War II was probably, the one war of, the last century and a half that had to be fought. But in some ways, it's been poison to the body politic. There's a book called The Best War Ever. And that's, of course, a sarcastic take on World War II. But the reason it was written is because the legacy of that war is with us. I mean, Jimmy, all the way up to the Iraq War, folks were saying, well, if we appease Saddam Hussein, then it'll be like Munich all over again, where we appeased, Hitler. And they did the same thing for Bashar al-Assad and the Taliban. And they're going to do it to the next enemy and the 7 or 8 enemies we have right now that we're actively bombing, and the other 20 enemies we have that we aren't just yet. It's really been a poisonous war. It's been used to prop up the empire. And that's what I want to say. This is an empire. And one thing I don't want to be misunderstood about, this is not a Trump empire. And my article and Matt's article is not a Trump article. It is a systemic imperial problem. If you want a buffoonish emperor, we've got a Bush for you. If you want a polite emperor, we got an Obama. And if you want a coarse emperor, we got a Trump. But it's the same empire.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I have a couple of questions. Well, first of all, I just want people always criticize Trump for being a draft dodger, and I was one of those people. And it seems like that's a bad tack to take, because someone made the argument that if John McCain would have beat Barack Obama, he would have had no more moral authority to engage in the war in Libya or Afghanistan or than Barack Obama, who never served. They're both committing horrible atrocities. So the fact that you served and killed other people in Vietnam doesn't give you moral authority to do it in Yemen or Libya or Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, or anywhere else, right? So my question is, what do you say to people who criticize Donald Trump because he didn't serve?
Well, I mean, I think it's ridiculous, because you can point, that same thing is going to be used against your favorite Democrat someday who didn't serve, whether it's a Clinton or an Obama. And let's not make any mistake. Barron Trump is no more likely to join the military or marry a service member than, Sasha and Malia were. So in general, the elites aren't serving any longer. And I sort of reject the notion that we focus on character, rather than policy, which is, of course, the name of the game in the duopoly, as you often point out, right? Focus on what we don't like ad hominem or pejorative about this person. Oh, he was a draft dodger. Well, so are a lot of folks who are, in Congress today and going to be our president in the future. I'm more interested in who's willing to challenge empire. Nobody's done it so far. Trump said some pretty nice stuff. He hasn't followed through. And when I even mentioned that Trump has said some reasonable stuff, like in his last inaugural when he said great nations don't fight endless wars, I loathe Trump. But that was correct. Now, he hasn't followed through. But even mentioning that on my behalf gets me vitriol from, the polite left that I otherwise associate with.
So I hear you 100%. You have to block those people out because they're very pro-war. That's the problem. The Democratic Party, someone tweeted out today, and I retweeted it, the Democratic Party today is indistinguishable from the Republican Party under George Bush. It's two war parties. It's really just one war party. It's the money party, and they really like war. So how important do you think it is for ordinary people so just to conclude on Donald Trump, it doesn't matter why someone skipped a war. If you skipped out because you were dodging it or because you actually had a medical problem, whenever you can skip out on killing other people for capitalists, that's a good call, right?
Absolutely. I'd actually really like to elect a pacifist or a Quaker or a draft dodger from the Vietnam War who was proud about that. That would be great with me. At least that's a principled stand. So, I don't think it makes you a better president because, you drop bombs on folks and I don't think that I'm any more qualified to speak out just because I have, this veteran platform. No doubt it probably gets me, some publications and attention. But in some sense, that itself is an obscene thing, isn't it?
Yes. So do you think it's important for ordinary citizens to speak out against the war, even though they'll be criticized as being armchair quarterbacks and have their credentials questioned because you've never served?
I think it's absolutely vital. We need to reject the valorization and the canonization of the soldier in the first place. And fighting against war is actually one of the hardest things to do, speaking out against your war, because, as MLK said, dissent is misunderstood as disloyalty. It is to me. I mean, I'm called a traitor and a Russian asset, and I'm not alone. Tulsi as well, as you know.
Yes.
I think it's vital to speak out on the issues that are hardest to speak out about and reframe patriotism as, in most cases or many cases, dissent. Because the platitude of patriotism hasn't gotten us anywhere, has it? Except, trillions of dollars in debt and 7,000 dead soldiers and probably about 2.2 million foreigners since 9/11.
And so now I want to talk about the conflicts of soldiers who awaken to this problem. So when you were serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, what was your feeling about those wars at the time you were serving?
I kind of went on my own intellectual and ethical journey. I evolved, right? Not to sound like Obama on gay marriage, but I did. I was skeptical of the Iraq War while I was there, and I turned against it. Initially, I thought, well, this war's not winnable, and that's why we shouldn't do it. Then I started to think maybe we shouldn't really be here in the first place, in general, across the board. And then only later, especially after Afghanistan and going to grad school and teaching history at West Point, which made me sort of an insurgent, I started to think maybe the entire imperial structure, the system of militarism and the military-industrial complex is what we really have to fight. So, I evolved, but I'll tell you, maybe I'm ahead of a lot of folks and definitely more radical, if that's the word. But I'm seeing a sea change within the military, within the veterans ranks, and even in the active duty, many of whom I still speak to, including former students of mine who are lieutenants in Afghanistan now and will text me, opposition to the war that they're currently fighting, privately. Last point on this, I'm a member of a number of anti-war veteran organizations and run a podcast from that perspective. And, right after this show, Fortress on a Hill, we're doing a live stream where we're bringing in a slew of anti-war veterans, enlisted officers, West Point grads. And it's almost going to be like our little mini winter soldier hearing from the Vietnam War, explaining our culpability and fighting against the war state. So we're out there, but you won't see us on MSNBC, Jimmy. You know that.
Yes, that's very interesting. I'm so glad you brought that up. I almost let that slip right past me. So this is a great article. I'm sure you've been contacted by Jake Tapper and Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes. They want to bring you on TV to talk about this, right?
Well, it's funny because you mentioned how the Democrats were a lot like the Bush administration in '03.
Mm-hmm.
Just watch Rachel Maddow, right, who I used to have a lot of respect for 10 years ago, wrongfully. Her show now, the guest list, it's a Bush alumni party from the Bush administration. It's amazing. It's born again war criminals,
Mm-hmm.
and they're laundered like dirty money through Las Vegas onto MSNBC. So of course they're not calling me, even though Rachel's first book, Drift, identified these very problems. It was an excellent book, and she's a smart woman, and she obviously has no ethical core. I've, on other radio shows, I've challenged her to a debate on MSNBC. She doesn't care about me, but I would wipe the floor with her Oxford education, I promise you.
Yeah, I know you would, because you have the truth on your side. So can you speak to so there's lots of problems, right? So I had Tulsi on the show, and, she was a strong voice calling out the intelligence community and our BS foreign wars, which no one else would do. No one else. It is very vital that she did that. Unfortunately, she ended up endorsing the biggest warmonger running, which was such a crusher for me, right? When you try to challenge people who are currently serving, see, because when people I talk to people who are former military, they all say they apologize to the people of the countries that they invaded and they killed people in or whatever. But current people like Tulsi couldn't do that, right? And I said, what do you say to those people? Because it's weird that you can be against the wars, which she is. She correctly frames them, which she does. She correctly calls out the intelligence community, yet she can't tell people not to join anymore. Like there's some kind of you're kind of betraying your service if you because I go, don't you feel bad that your service might attract other people to go serve in these bogus wars? And so what do you say to that?
No, I mean, this is an important problem. One of the, mistakes, although I think it wasn't a mistake at all that I made, was, I wrote my first book, Ghost Riders for Baghdad, while I was, still in the Army. And actually it came out when I was teaching at West Point. And I was writing these anti-war columns, right on the blurred line of what's legal and what's not within the Army. And it got me, investigated, in trouble. My pension, was threatened, all this stuff.
Really?
It's a difficult thing. But I will tell you this, it is a difficult thing to ask any former or serving officer to tell people not to join or, to disobey orders. But during the Vietnam War, one of the kind of blacked out and whitewashed histories of how that war ended is it wasn't Congress who saved us, and it wasn't, the Kennedy brothers or their Democratic Party, and it wasn't even the college kids protesting on campus, although they were an important component. One of the main factors was GI resistance. Folks refused to go on patrol. They had these underground newspapers and coffee shops. Now, part of the reason for that is because they were draftees. And in the volunteer force, that's much harder. However, I think as we saw with the Captain Crozier incident on the aircraft carrier, there are those rumblings I mentioned among, even active duty soldiers and sailors. And, there's a lot of power in that serving and even veteran community because even though it's kind of gross and problematic, folks trust us. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we don't have the moral authority they lend us. But if we have it, then I think it becomes an obligation to speak out. And so, I think people have to follow their conscience when it's in the service. I wish I would have had the courage to speak out earlier than 2015, and there's a lot of reasons, none of them very good that I didn't. But for the folks out there listening, I'm not in uniform anymore. I'm not afraid to say it. If your conscience says don't do it, then don't.
So doesn't a military person have an obligation to the Constitution, right? So that's what they're and that if someone gives you an illegal order, you're supposed to disobey it. And isn't the Iraq War one big illegal order?
This is such an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Every time I got promoted and when I first got in, I had to take, my oath to follow the, orders of the President of the United States. But that's secondary. The main part of the oath is support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I don't remember the last time we constitutionally declared war. It was 1941. And, according to the Nuremberg principles, which we kind of shepherded, the number one crime, they said, the number one war crime is the crime of aggression, of aggressive war. Framed that way, pretty much everything that we are doing currently is illegal and immoral. And so, I question the entire concept that we have some sort of obligation to be company men, because that's what a lot of these folks, these retired generals, these serving generals who go on MSNBC or Fox, it doesn't matter what side of the duopoly they're on. What they are is company men carrying water for the empire. And I'm complicit. I did it for a long time, but it is gross. And it's destroying what's left of the small R republic, if there is any.
So if people, so if there's a war with Iran or China, do you think that the enlisted men should refuse to go? And at what point should a soldier refuse?
Well, I'll be cautious here, not for my own sake, but because it's a difficult thing to tell somebody what they should do. I will say that I like to believe, and although there's not a ton of evidence to support it, I'd like to believe that if we started another war with Iran, which would be grotesquely illegal and unstrategic, that I personally would pack it in. And folks have. There are Camila Meha, was one of the first people to refuse, and there was a lieutenant up in Washington. I do think that the time is coming for we'll call it a wildcat sit-down strike on the aircraft carriers and in the armored brigades. And people are going to attack me for saying that. And at this point, I don't really care, because the bloodshed that's on all of our hands, because these wars are fought in our names. Civilians like me now, it's fought in our names. Just because there's no draft doesn't mean we're not complicit. We're all in on the system.
So here's another difficult question. How do you criticize the senseless and pointlessness of these wars to family members and friends of people who've died in these wars, and they have to believe that their death meant something? So how do you square that circle?
Well, it's something that I personally deal with on the daily. I mean, my inbox filled up with more than the usual hate mail today because of this article, and most of it was, sort of reflexive from veterans and in some cases family members of like, oh my God, are you guys, you and Matt Ho, are you saying that you're not in favor of honoring the dead? Well, that's of course ridiculous. I'm not a monster, at least not mostly. And frankly, my son, who's maybe 12 feet from me at this moment, is named after 3 soldiers who died under my command in Iraq. One of whom was, 2 of whom were totally close friends. There's pictures of them on my wall. We have to be big enough and intellectual enough to hold 2 opposing concepts in our head at the same time, which is that it is important to honor the folks who died that you loved, that they were fighting for their brothers, all the platitudes, but they're true. And also understand that the best way to honor them, I think, and I'd like to believe they'd feel, is to, create less dead Americans as well as less dead Yemeni children whose skins, if they were less brown, and religion of their parents, if they were less Muslim, would just horrify Americans, children. And, so I understand that I'm close to the family members of some of the soldiers that died under my command, very close. And I understand that there is a need for some of them to hold on to the old notion of patriotism, and they fear that if they turn against the wars, they're somehow turning against their son. I can't tell them how to feel, but I think that it is an obligation for those of us who read and think and really give a damn about this country to separate the two and hold the 2 opposing views in our head at the same time. They ain't all that opposing either.
So do you find a problem? See, because the tricky part is in consoling them, it means that believing that some past war was worthy, which then means that a future war is worthy. And as we know now, they aren't.
It's a difficult thing. I think that, we have to be okay with saying that a consensus of historians agrees, by the way, probably there were only 2 wars fought in American history that were worth fighting. And that's the one that freed the slaves indirectly and somewhat directly, and then the one against the Nazis that we eventually got stuck in, but only largely because of the failures of the first war. Right. Yes, it's a difficult thing. It really is.
Right. And so when you say you want to reboot Memorial Day, how would you like to see Memorial Day rebooted?
I think just to simplify it, I'd like to see it used as a jumping off point like we are right now to question and challenge the war state. and to provide some empathy for the folks we kill, and to recognize that the American way of war has become so outsourced, mercenary, and technocratic that mercenaries, militias, and machines are killing people with little cost to us. So, I'm not saying we ditch the concept of honoring troops. I'm saying maybe we put that on pause for a while until we figure out how to put this republic back together, ditch the empire, and really honor these kids, right, which they largely are, by ending the system that's going to send the next generation to die in some hopeless, futile, and frankly immoral endeavor. If we can even talk about that, that's a small victory. And in America today, that's about the best we're getting as small victories.
Why do you think the news media, even though you and I both know they know better, pushes every war? Why does Rachel Maddow, even though she wrote a book about it, still a militarist? Why does the New York Times, every war, they're for it on their front page? Why is that an accident? Because Anand Giridharadas just wrote a book, and he's going around saying that there isn't a systemic problem with the news media. It's individual journalists who have habits of mind. What do you say? You're an intellectual and an academic, plus you have war experience. What do you think the reason is that the news media ubiquitously gets war wrong and is pro-war every time?
Well, because like Congress, they're bought, sold, and derelict in their duty. They're all owned by the same people. It's thrown around like a cliche, but there really are only a few people who own these media institutions. And war sells as entertainment and clickbait. That's why they have eagles flying in front of Bradley tanks before we go kill people in Iraq. And that's where the funding comes from. That's where your bread is buttered. Having me on, or Jimmy, you're famous. Even having you on isn't going to help their bottom line. These are contrived talk shows where the very narrow left and right limits, unlike on your show, are laid out beforehand. So what you have is the illusion of an oppositional media, when in reality, the military-industrial complex, like Eisenhower originally wanted to do in his speech, really needs to be broadened to say military, industrial, congressional, media complex, because everybody is complicit in the same system. Everybody wins at the top. Everybody scratches everybody's back and retweets everybody and plugs them. But you know who loses? The kids that I know from the housing projects and the rural towns that we threw overboard with the steel industry 40 years ago. Those were the kids that I fell in love with, that I served with. They don't win. And yet we adulate them on the football field as, a D-level participation ribbon. And the whole thing is gross. And if I sound a little angry about it, it's because I'm letting myself, because we all should be.
And you're definitely right. Let me ask you quickly about what did people in the military think about the intelligence community, the Democratic Party, and the news media pushing an evidence-free red-baiting conspiracy theory against the president, who's the commander-in-chief and was actively ordering people into battle?
Well, the Democratic Party and the media and Russiagate, in my experience, are very unpopular, highly unpopular, maybe more in the military than even most places. The military is not a monolith politically like it maybe once was, or maybe it never was. It's never been just conservative. But, ginning up a new Cold War that means their blood based on what has demonstrably been, probably lies, definitely some lies, and really just obfuscation across the board and unbacked conjecture, that's not a winner. That is not a winner with the veteran community. Let's remember, Lincoln gets elected, play historian, largely on the ballots of the soldiers who were allowed to come back or mail them in, like the first ever mail ballots. And, this is not a winner for Nancy Pelosi. I mean, this is, if anyone's more unpopular than Trump, with soldiers, I guarantee you it's her. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important point. Look, Russiagate was a distraction from the reality, which is we should have been critiquing Trump on his active foreign policy and calling on him to live up to some of his relatively earthy and correct campaign promises, instead of holding his feet to the fire on empire and whatever else, even domestically. No. We threw all our chips in for a scam, for the Iraq War gate of my generation. And who picked it up, Jimmy? You did. Matt Taibbi did. But how many people in the mainstream media?
None.
If they found that, they don't have jobs anymore.
Yeah, none of the people in the mainstream media. I mean, I guess Matt Taibbi's mainstream. He writes for Rolling Stone. So that would be it. Glenn Green as The Intercept. I mean, everybody else at The Intercept was Russiagating besides Glenn Greenwald, so he got it right. So that was nice. That the editor of the Intercept still Russiagating till this day at the top of her lungs, 100 miles an hour, still doing that. It's amazing.
Well, one Russian asset to another, Jimmy. I mean, I'm going to call my handler after this show, Vlad, and tell him what we talked about. But it's amazing, though. That's a cudgel. I will just say this: before Trump was elected, I got a lot of hate then too. But it was always that I was a traitor and I hated America. But after Trump was elected, then it became, you love Trump and you're a Russia apologist and a Russian asset. I think that's instructive, actually, because my views didn't change.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, your views didn't change, but there's smear tactics against people telling the truth about war change. That's all. That's the only thing that happened. So we hear about the human cost of war, and do you have anything to say about what war does to? So a lot of people say, I'll worry about animals as soon as I can get people to start worrying about people. Mm-hmm. And other people make the argument that if we don't address how we treat animals, which is what the undergirds this our whole culture, not only through animal agriculture, but even the way war treats the environment and the cruelty to animals. From a military testing, the effects of sanctions, pollutions from our weapons, and generations of collateral damage. Can you talk about some of that stuff that's the military mindset is inflicted on the earth?
Yeah, in the name of this apparently indispensable nation of ours and our freedom on the tip of a bayonet military that we adulate and canonize. In the name of that, we're the number one polluter, the Department of Defense. Our own soldiers are poisoned by Gulf War syndrome and Agent Orange, and now batteries being burned in burn pits. I don't know how many class action suits I've gotten emails asking me to be a part of. It's every generation. It's the same way. And the focus, if at all, is a 2-minute clip on the veterans. We do very little to talk about our influence on the climate and on the environment in a lot of these places. Just one perfect example is that the most of those deaths that you mentioned in my article and me and Matt Ho's article in Yemen and Somalia are actually famine and disease and cholera. What folks don't realize is that, as I wrote in a recent article, the number one epidemic exacerbator in history is war.
Right.
And that was true with the Native Americans, and it's true in Yemen today when you've got desertification in West Africa and East Africa that is already existing from the climate and our contribution to it with the Pentagon. And then you throw drones and refugees and raids on top of that. It's a petri dish. It's a petri dish before people started talking about that when Americans started dying from corona. It's always been there. Our sins are manifold and they're interconnected. And that's the structural part.
And it's what people don't realize, which is just so crazy that everyone would want to go to war because they thought Assad killed 50 people with a chlorine bomb, whereas we are literally committing siege warfare on Yemen, which I don't know if you know, that is a war crime. You're not allowed to do that. And that's why 75,000 children died of a famine during a war, because we are blocking medicine, food, any kind of help from getting into those people. And that's called siege warfare. That's illegal. We're doing that. That's the United States. So then we point our finger at Putin and say he's a strong man, he's a thug, or Assad's a thug, or Gaddafi's a thug. The biggest thug in the history of humankind is the United States of America. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And it took me a long time to come to that place, longer than it should have. It's really important what you're saying here. Let's talk about Yemen. I like to be flippant, but hey, at least the guys we're supporting who are doing it, at least it's a really nice freedom-loving regime, the Saudis, right, where they still burn women for witchcraft and sorcery. It's on the books, folks. Putin is a monster. All right, I'm not a fan of Russian foreign policy per se, but it's less aggressive than American foreign policy. It's killing less folks directly and indirectly. That doesn't mean I support it. It means I'm willing to hold those same two opposing ideas in my head at the same time. Putin is an imperfect, somewhat problematic leader for the Russians to worry about. But America, using the witch-burning regime that happens to have a lot of oil, is starving children. And we've been doing it for quite some time. And they also backed a guy called Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. I heard that somewhere. And it was our money that helped do it. So blowback 101, Empire 101, when are we going to stop it?
When
are we
going
to sit down?
When are we? I mean, everybody I talk to, so I travel all over the country. And before the pandemic, I would travel everywhere, every weekend, going somewhere else. And no matter where, to a person, everybody was like, no one ever says more war. Everyone says, let's get out of these wars and put that money into our own country, into infrastructure or education or healthcare or whatever. So, and then Trump gets elected on an anti-interventionist platform. They immediately turn him. They give him an extra $131 billion to go bomb people as they say he's in bed with our enemies, which those two things don't make sense. That's how you know they're lying about Russiagate. And they give him an extra $131 billion, and he doesn't complain about it. So there's no way to stop this machine, right? I mean, it's short of a real revolution, right, Danny?
Well, yeah, some sort of version of a general strike, which you've advocated. You know, when you had Christian Smalls on from blue collar Staten Island, where I grew up. You know, we have to apply that to the empire, and we have to connect, because the media won't do it for us. They ain't going to connect the dots. The dots give them a job. What needs to be connected is the opportunity cost of every dollar spent on the aircraft carrier, right? Every person killed overseas that blows back on us. I mean, this is domestic and foreign policy are completely connected. Working in the system has never stopped an American war. Never. And that goes since 1607, when a white dude showed up in Virginia. And if we think it's going to work now, it's like thinking that Nancy Pelosi is going to put universal health care in the bailout. It's the same delusion. It's the same delusion. It's the same sickness with, different symptoms. It's gross. And we got to quit with delusions because, like the Bible says, and I'm not religious, childish things need to be left behind. Americans, not so keen on that so far. And it's only been like 400 years, Jimmy. So, I'm holding out my hope.
Would you extend that same philosophy to reformation of our political parties? Because I know a lot of people still believe that the answer is somehow sucking some more corporate cock, backing the Democratic Party another time, and then trying to get back at them in 4 years. That's exactly what you said. That's childish things, right?
Well, it is. And, I haven't even like taken a position on, endorsing anybody. I'm not important enough. But I wrote an article called Gambling on Biden's Foreign Policy about 2 weeks ago. And I literally got more hate mail, all from the left, from the polite liberals, in one morning than I did in the month before. And that's saying something, because I dared mention that Biden is an emperor. He's a little bit less polite than Obama, but he's of the polite emperor mold. He's going to smile like Uncle Joe from Scranton or wherever, or HSBC or whatever. And the reality is, if you gamble on Biden thinking he's going to end the empire, you're in a delusion. You may as well be one of these Mike Pompeo, the rapture's coming in Israel types, because it's not going to happen. If you choose to vote for Biden and you know what you're getting, look, you got to do what you got to do. And I'm done. I'm done with the duopoly. I think Trump is a threat in a number of ways in the climate. But listen, if you think that Biden is going to, dismantle the empire, I mean, I've got oceanfront property in Arizona, as George Strait said.
Can you speak before we let you go? I know you got to get to your own show. Troop suicides mirror the slow suicide of all humanity right now, and the military is a big part of that. What are your thoughts on the high numbers of troop suicides?
A lot of folks said that I didn't pay enough attention honoring troops in my article today. I was like, well, you didn't read the article, because I talked about substance abuse and suicide as an epidemic within the military, and how maybe if we're going to memorialize anybody, let's focus on them, because they're about 1,000 times higher than how many soldiers died in Yemen. On a personal level, both for me and Matt Ho, the Marine and State Department whistleblower who I wrote this with, 3 soldiers under my command, direct command, took their own lives. All right, 2 of those were substance abuse related. The invisible wound is real, and it ain't just a platitude, even though it sounds like one. But what we like to do is say, what a shame that 22 or 17 or whatever the stat is, veterans are killing themselves today. What a shame. If we thank them more in the airport and pick up a few more checks at TGI Fridays, that'll do it. Never saying, what is it about readjustment to civilian life from forever war where they're never going to see a victory? What is it about that process that is causing a suicide and a substance abuse epidemic? It actually, for me, it's hard, because people that I love took their own lives. And then I'll tell you, you want to talk about substance abuse? Hang out with me after a funeral in Salina, Kansas for a Mexican-American kid who was the best soldier ever and then takes his own life. It's really problematic. And the folks that are going to be on my live show right after this doing our kind of winter soldier, give our thoughts on the wars thing, almost every one of them is either personally affected with those, depression and PTSD and substance abuse, or knows somebody who critically has either taken their life or come close. That epidemic, that story, if we don't tie it to the empire and to the forever war state, then we're doing a disservice to every one of those people who took their own lives and the future ones, because, it'll be 17 more tomorrow. So just hold on.
I have no idea how people readjust after being in a war zone. I saw a dog get hit by a car. I still have nightmares. I have no idea how people can, and I'm not making a joke about that. Like, that's for real. So I have no idea. I'm such a fragile dude in that way. So I can't even imagine how, the stuff that you see and you have to do. And I've heard soldiers talk about the stuff they were ordered to do and the things they had, ripping people out of their houses and making people stand against walls and all kind, just the things they had to do is just, I don't know how they do it. So yeah, aren't you surprised that there was a town, I think, in Utah that decided to make sure that none of their veterans were homeless. Aren't you surprised there isn't like a nationwide program like that?
I wish I was surprised. I mean, I do. I wish that I was surprised by that. I wish that I had enough faith in our systems to think that, our big bear hug of freedom would go all the way down to the kids from Western Pennsylvania who serve and die in our military and come back broken physically and emotionally. But I'm not surprised because, the system isn't designed for them. They may be water carriers for that system and we may thank them, but, they're the detritus of empire, and every empire has produced them, and we ain't all that different from them. It's gross on so many levels, but I think that it's actually an insult to the military, to veterans that we purport to adulate, and we play all their movies on, TBS every Memorial Day and Veterans Day. Frankly, I find these holidays wretched at this point, which is why this year Matt and I wrote an article saying, let's just ditch it, or at least reframe the whole thing. Because frankly, I'm sick of writing anti-war articles on Memorial Day because I don't have a lot of faith that they're doing any good. But I do hope that, like when it comes to, the Occupy style movement and economic inequality, that we, take those direct action grassroots messages from history and realize that those are the tactics that work. And I listen to you regularly, and I don't think I've seen an episode in a year where you didn't mention the necessity of that. And I appreciate it. And I think a lot of veterans out there do, because we're not a monolith, and a whole lot of us, quietly mostly, but a whole lot of us are just about fed up. And apathy is the most insulting thing. I'd rather be called a baby killer, which isn't completely even wrong, but I'd rather be insulted directly than have, citizen apathy. But that's what reigns, and that's what the media produces. They're part of the game.
What was the word you used? They are the detritus of empire. What was that word?
The detritus of empire.
What does that word mean? How do you spell that word? That's a good word.
Detritus. Yeah. Just like the trash of empire, the leftovers of empire. And this has been the case throughout history. I mean, the British Empire had the same thing. You got these broken imperial soldiers who come home. They don't recognize the country they just came from, who do they, not all of them, but who do a lot of them take it out on? The immigrants to London who came from the same place they were just trying to pacify. I mean, this whole thing works in such a way to divide us, whether it's, by class or ethnicity or immigrant status. But, my generation is just the newest, post-Vietnam generation of broken empire, of broken soldiers that really are the detritus of empire. So, forgive me for not being excited about Joe Biden, who was the #1 cheerleader for the Iraq War. That broke me, right? And maybe I'm not a tough enough guy. Maybe that's possible. I got a lot of weaknesses. I will tell you that watching teenagers get executed on the side of the road in Iraq because they were Shia or Sunni and we started that war, that broke me. And it changed my life. Now, I'm glad it did, but forgive me for not getting excited about the guy who defended what he called popular President Bush, 6 months into that war, when it was clear we didn't have a single WMD to be found. And, the Civil War had already kind of kicked off. So, I can't get excited for him.
Do you think there is a chance of soldiers refusing to serve at any point?
I think it's, if I'm a little hopeful, I'm not optimistic. Something to keep in mind. I mean, people talk about the all-volunteer force. It, in and of itself, the all-volunteer force was designed not by some hippie, SDS activist on a college campus. It was designed by Richard Nixon. It was designed by the Republican Party to squelch dissent. That's why it was created. So expecting, the all-volunteer force to suddenly, behave like the conscripts of Vietnam is again, it's sort of another illusion. However, if you push even a volunteer force, which isn't really volunteer, it's an economic draft. I mean, just look at the soldiers I served with. I mean, come on.
Right.
But even if you push volunteers far enough and you keep them at war for decades, because we're going to go into our 3rd decade of war, not too far from now, I think you'll see pushback. I think you'll see more folks who passively, aggressively kind of revolt like the sailors did on Captain Crozier's, pandemic ship. But as for, refusal to serve, less likely. And final point, so long as the things that you constantly talk about continue, which is economic disparity, unemployment, and the gig economy at the bottom, also part of the same system. So long as that doesn't change, then folks are gonna leave their crappy towns and neighborhoods to serve in a place that's the most socialist institution in America, where even if you're 19 and you've got 2 kids and a teenage wife, because I hung out at their houses, the Army gives you a house and universal health care and at least a living wage, mostly. So, my point is, if you think that on the demand end, less folks are going to join, even that's unlikely so long as we maintain the oligarchy. And again, it's not conspiratorial to say that it's part of the same system because Nixon designed it. Nixon, not George McGovern, not John F. Kennedy.
Danny Sjursen, thanks so much. Retired Major Danny Sjursen, anti-war activist, host of The Fortress on a Hill, which is doing a live stream starting right now. Is that on a YouTube live stream?
We're on Facebook.
Facebook?
Fortress
Okay.
on a Hill. Check us out. And if you don't mind, if you want to check out my columns, I'm a contributing editor at antiwar.com, and my website is skepticalvet.com. So I'm all over the place, even Mother Jones, which is for only the 2nd time. But thanks so much for having me, Jimmy, and having this honest conversation that I couldn't have had anywhere else. Number 1, because they wouldn't have invited me, and number 2, because very few people are asking these questions.
Well, I really appreciate your work and your advocacy and your truth-telling and your courage to do so, and it really makes a big difference. So thanks again, and we look forward to talking to you. Hey, and let me know when your book is out. It's called Patriotic Dissent, and we'll have you back on, okay?
Thanks, Jimmy. Glad to do it anytime.
Okay, buddy. Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?